All right, yield nerds, I thought I would talk to all of you one more time because the Fed has raised rates twice. And in our show, we've been trying to construct your personal yield curve. And so I thought I'd walk you through whether the recent rate hikes that the Fed has instituted has changed anything in a big way or not. And if it has, where have the changes occurred? So the news flash that we are trying to answer is, did recent Fed policy change your personal yield curve? And if these terms are too foreign for you, please watch previous episodes of Yield Nerd. We talk about the yield curve, we talk about some tax treatments, we talk about comparing various fixed income assets. And my usual disclaimers, this is not investment advice, it is education. You make the decisions. I am not a wealth management advisor and I don't have anything to sell you. I'm not pitching any product. So, welcome to Yield Nerd, an educational show about how you can acquire and manage yield. The way we're going to organize this episode is to first kind of recap what we meant by the yield Super Bowl. We're going to talk about how we're going to set up each and every one of these securities so we can compare them fairly. How did we do it before? What results did we have when we did this about 8-ish weeks ago? Where are we today? And what does it all mean for the future? So, to recap, when we talked about fixed income assets, we picked treasuries. We talked about the yield curve for that. We plotted the yield curve for agencies in earlier episodes. We then overlaid munis on top of those and looked at duration. And then we put corporates and we put them all together and said in the short duration, which one wins, in the medium duration, which one wins, and so on. So if this is foreign to you, please refresh your memory by watching previous episodes, but we specifically did a couple of things to set up these fixed income assets so we can compare them against each other. What did we do? First is we obviously compared 3-month treasuries with 3-month agencies, and in the rare occasion, 3-month munis if they are available, and so on. And we would then compare each duration only within the same duration across the assets. That's pretty obvious. The next thing we did specific to tax is we said, hey, treasuries do not incur state tax, but they are federally taxable. So we're going to look at the pre-tax yield of treasuries by bumping up the yield by whatever the state tax is. Agencies, in certain cases, and you should see previous episodes if you do not recollect or you do not know which agency bonds are not state taxable, while which ones are indeed state taxable. And so we're going to pick the ones that are state taxable to give them the best advantage, bump those by the state tax. We're going to then pick the munis, which are federal tax exempt, and in some cases state tax exempt, and you should again refresh your memory. But we're going to bump up the muni yields by your federal tax rate so you can get a pre-tax comparison for munis. And corporates are fully taxable, so we're just going to take their yield exactly the way it is. So by doing these adjustments, we get a fair comparison of the pre-tax yield of each of these assets. Now, you may remember Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, for example, these are public-private partnerships. They are fully taxable, so we're not going to take those. Some muni bonds in some states are taxable. Illinois is one of them. And so we're not going to bump up the muni bond yield by state tax. We're only going to bump it up by federal tax. And last but not the least, in some of my previous episodes, I had indicated that I personally use the effective tax when I bump up muni bond yields and not the marginal tax or the last dollar tax. And you can refer to why I do that. But we'll be bumping up the yield of munis by the effective tax rate, and we'll look at various tax brackets. And so to kind of go back to where we were and recap what we did before, please remember, I'm not giving you tax advice, but let's look at what we saw 8 weeks earlier. 8 weeks earlier, when we looked at the highest tax bracket, and the reason I picked the highest tax bracket is that gives munis the greatest advantage. Even in the highest tax bracket, in the short duration, treasuries gave excellent returns. In the medium duration, agencies dominated. And in the 5+ years, when you only threw, munis at it, the single A munis indeed were advantageous only in the long duration. That's only when you compare treasuries, agencies, and munis at the highest tax rate. Now, as we saw, in certain cases, munis are state taxable. However, your federal income tax is the bigger number. And so the higher your federal tax bracket, the better munis will look good to you. And at a much lower federal income tax rate, munis really are not going to be advantageous for you. And so we then introduced corporate bonds a few weeks ago and said, okay, let me put corporate bonds on top of that and compare those. And when we compared corporate bonds, again in the low duration, treasuries won, and the medium agencies won, and corporates seemed pretty good in the long duration, that's when we introduced the concept of a yield Super Bowl. And we said, gee, I wonder what will happen if we bumped up munis and corporate bonds in the long duration. And the answer that was given was that when you look at long durations, and you compared munis in the long duration with corporates in the long duration, we saw that treasuries and agencies still kept their place, but corporates beat munis in the 10-year mark. And the only time munis, even at the highest tax bracket, the only time they made a dent, this again is 8 weeks ago, the only time munis made a dent was in 30 years plus. So that's the history. The question then is, where are we today, given federal rate hikes, new bonds in the market? So let's reveal the surprise for right now. Now, if I try to put all of this data in one place, the AAA, the AA, the single A for corporate, the AAA, the AA, the single A for munis and treasuries and agencies, it is very, very messy. So we're going to simplify things a little bit. We are only going to look at A-rated corporates and A-rated munis. By that I mean the single A-rated corporates and munis understandably will have the highest yield. So we're just going to pick the highest yield corporates, highest yield munis. We're also going to compare them only with agency bonds that are state tax exempt, meaning we're going to take the best of everything and get them to clash against each other. And to give a very good tax advantage for munis, we're going to assume a really high effective tax rate of 28%. Remember, this is not marginal tax rate, this is effective tax rate. So when we put all of this, treasuries are getting punched in the chin while we are boosting agencies, corporates, and munis. So let's see what happens. Drum roll. Now when we compare single A rated corporates, single A rated munis versus treasuries and agencies, treasuries still dominate far and away in the less than 9-month time frame. In the less than 3-5 year time frame, agencies still dominate, which is pretty wild. Corporates now start looking good after 5 years. That is a little bit of a change. What that is telling you is new bonds that are being issued, corporations are forced to pay you a higher premium for the 5 year duration, or they will not be competitive with treasuries at all. So there are some good pickings out there for corporate bonds past the 5 year duration. Munis, you may remember, you had to go 30 years before there was anything useful. There are some interesting muni bonds past the 10-year mark now that are interesting. Now, again, remember, this is at a 28% effective tax rate. If your effective tax rate is south of that, it is unlikely you will have much interest in munis. That still is true, but the tide is turning. Corporates are forced to issue a higher rate because the federal, treasuries are paying so much. And my humble opinion, and I am no prognosticator of the future, As the federal funds rate, the increase in it starts decelerating, then there will be some very interesting dynamics for us to look like. And we'll keep revisiting the yield curve every 8 weeks or so, and you can see how this changes. All said and done, in the short duration, treasuries are king. In the medium duration, agencies are queen. If your tax bracket is less than, if your effective tax is less than 20%, forget about munis. At 28% on the high end, you can start looking at some of the newer corporate bonds and munis, and you should make your own decisions on that. So, what does it all mean for the next couple of months? Number one, there are risks of bankruptcies that may arise because highly debt-laden companies that have to pay a lot, and if there is a recession or if there is a deceleration in revenue and earnings, you're going to see pressure in those bonds with poor credit ratings. The odds of even a reasonably good credit rated corporation being around for 30 years, paying you par, paying you the coupon, is definitely lower than the odds of a muni or the odds of the treasury, obviously. And so to just sit here and say, a corporate bond is the same as a muni bond doesn't really take into account the risk factor behind it. Having said that, the premium that munis and corporates ought to pay for a longer duration doesn't yet seem to be attractive enough to make you want to jump to them for the 5 year mark, for example. And so that may or may not get corrected over a course of time, and there is some work to be done to understand that better, and we'll keep refreshing our lessons for you. The most important lesson here is to know your duration and invest wisely. If you want any of the worksheets that were used behind the scenes to compute these educational materials and the insights, email me and I will gladly share it with you. Thank you for listening to YieldNerd. More to come. Thank you for listening to Yield Nerd, a do-it-yourself show for yield accumulation and management.